Welcome to the chaos sector. Let's continue our path in the Matrix. Today we focus on Michael Knowles. He is one of the most impactful figures in the conservative movement as he speaks to the youth at universities across the country. But there was one instant where he got flustered by someone deemed to be, well, ignorant. How could such an intelligent and well-spoken Knowles get tripped up by a dumb kid? Who also supports abortion? Well, let's find out. Now the title of the video is, Yikes, Woke Student Tries to School Michael Knowles on Abortion, and it completely backfires.
You keep defining abortion as the murder of babies, which biological fact is you would say most abortions are done before they are actually babies. It's still just a fetus. So my
Do
question...
you know what the word fetus means?
It's just a cluster, a
That's
zygote
not what
developing
fetus
into
means.
a baby eventually.
The word fetus, it's a Latin word, and it just means offspring. That's all it means. It just means the next
Does that mean
generation of a
baby?
being. But that's what a baby is also. I mean, that's what you would call your adult child someday once he's grown, hopefully if he hasn't been
Can I
murdered.
ask my question?
Well, I'm just like to clarify this point. You would call your adult child your offspring too, but all of these terms that you might use, fetus, embryo, the one they love is zygote, which sounds like a Pokemon, but they use all these different terms, but it's all referring to the same being, and you were that being once. You, the person who's standing here right now.
Do any of us have a memory of being that being?
No, I mean, I don't have a memory of last Thursday, frankly. It's been a very busy week, but the lack of a memory doesn't mean that it's all right to murder me.
Now at this point, it's going as it should. Knowles is educating the young female about abortion. But this is not where she is establishing her debate to him. The setting is a conservative versus a quote, woke liberal. She's at a disadvantage already against the witty Knowles, who will have a quick gotcha rebuttal to anything she says, right? Well, not so sure about that.
Well, anyways, my question is, you stress murdering babies a lot, but when it comes to murdering babies, kids, and everything in everyday shootings that keep happening, you say nothing. So I ask, why is it okay to murder babies when it's regulating women but not regulating guns?
No, I say quite a lot about that, actually. I think the crime is a terrible problem, and I think it's just awful that liberals have funded and intentionally installed liberal DAs who won't prosecute violent criminals. This has led to an increase in violent crime, and it's awful. I totally oppose that. But it's not me, and it's not my side that's funding that sort of thing.
I know there are a lot of Knowles fans out there, but he was hit with a clever question by the young lady. It's a clever question because it is presenting the same concept of caring about the unborn child as caring about the children who die in the so-called mass shootings. Keep in mind, we are in the Matrix, so this is all to expose both of them, conservative and liberal. But I find this scenario she presented very interesting because it's relevant to our take on the federal government's role in the so-called mass shootings. Knowles claimed to show a concern, but I noticed he went off on a little tangent, blaming liberal DAs for their role in not prosecuting criminals. A rebuttal to that from the left would be the so-called mass shootings are happening in Republican-led cities as well. Let's continue, because she is actually putting a bit of pressure on Knowles, believe it or not.
Now you say, why wouldn't I want to regulate guns? Guns are very regulated in the United States as it is, and I've yet to hear one gun control proposal that would stop any of these shooting incidents that people talk about. People focus on the sensationalized ones from the news, a school shooting or a movie theater shooting. No proposed gun control legislation of the last 30 years would have stopped any of those.
No proposed gun legislation in the last 30 years would have prevented the so-called mass shootings? Well, then is he suggesting that the federal government can't prevent children from being so-called massacred in the so-called mass shootings? If Knowles suggests that no gun legislation in the last 30 years is comprehensive or effective in preventing so-called mass shootings, then he is either suggesting the federal government is retarded, or the federal government is retarded. Those are the only two options. Since we know this is not true, we also know that Knowles is being dishonest in suggesting there are no preventive measures the federal government could take to stop the so-called mass shootings. What has been proposed and put into law is being depicted as ineffective, but this would once again suggest the federal government is incompetent. Think about it. If so-called mass shootings continue to happen at such an alarming rate, does Knowles suggest the federal government is incompetent? You know the federal government is not incompetent, they just don't care. Within the matrix, of course. In that matrix, the federal government would appear retarded because they can't figure out a plan to prevent gun violence and so-called mass shootings. So it forces those who are within the political matrix, such as Knowles, to make such an astonishing statement. The same federal government that has laws to ensure to protect the citizens' rights, the safety of drivers on the road, in the workplace, laws, everywhere that are working quite well. But somehow, when it comes to literally protecting the lives of children, in regards to gun violence and so-called mass shootings, the federal government just can't seem to figure out a law that will protect them? And this is what the young liberal is challenging Knowles about. What gives here? We have another double-edged sword here, and we stamp it onto Knowles. Either he believes that the federal government is retarded, or the federal government is complicit with the so-called mass shootings and common gun violence. From the sound of it, he is pretending the government is retarded. Either way, the young liberal has a great point to attack Knowles with. Dishonesty, and that dishonesty is causing him to pivot around the young lady's questioning of his sincerity. Why hasn't there been gun legislation passed that is effective in preventing the so-called mass shootings? Such an intelligent individual has a plan to present not only to this young lady and the audience, but also to present to the federal government, which by his perspective can't provide effective gun legislation. Are you following so far? Good.
And the majority of the shootings are gang-related, and they're handgun shootings. And so I'm all for cracking down on those gangs and throwing them all in the can, but it's usually the liberals telling me that we have to abolish the police and go soft on crime, and, they were just failed by society, and so we can't put them in prison, and we have to abolish the prisons too.
Once again, he seems more focused on attacking his political opponent rather than sticking to the core of the question. If you examine the split screen, we see that Knowles smiles when discussing gun violence, while the young liberal appears quite serious. This is an indication that he is not taking her serious about her question, due to being a liberal. After all, she supports abortion, so how can she care about those children being so-called massacred, right? But that's exactly the same problem Knowles would have, just the reverse. He advocates against abortion, but does he care about the children being so-called massacred in so-called mass shootings? This is what the liberal is trying to figure out, or expose. So it's somewhat of a standoff, as who has the moral ground to stand on. To this point, we know the young liberal supports abortion, which generally is condemned. But, if Knowles is quite evasive regarding gun regulations, what moral ground does he have in the debate? She presents the point about gun regulations as a devil's advocate dynamic to see if Knowles supports gun restrictions or even bans. And it appears he is being very evasive in supporting, or agreeing with, new gun regulations. The question was simple, although the young female didn't articulate it well. She is basically saying, if you care about the unborn child, and you advocate for banning abortion nationwide, then why hasn't there been the same advocacy for gun mandates on your behalf, such as restricting or banning assault rifles? His response to this question was the federal government hasn't provided effective gun legislation over the past 30 years. But, she is asking you, yes you, what is your suggestion, or solution, to the so-called mass shootings, which take the lives of the very children he claims to care so much about? The premise of her question is obvious here, it's about gun control, which would prevent or at least reduce the gun violence against children. Knowles is aware of the premise of the question, but is trying to avoid the main focus of the inquiry, and that's assault rifles. He seems to have a problem directly addressing that demographic of gun violence by way of assault rifles. But why? That shouldn't be difficult to address, right? Apparently it is, and I know why. And it seems this young lady knows why as well.
That's not me. I'm all for it. You want to get me a bill, you want to elect me to office and get a bill in front of me that will crack down on gang crime and these gangsters using handguns to kill kids? Let's do it. I'd sign that in 2 seconds.
Did you catch that? Knowles states he would lock up criminals killing kids with handguns. But this is not addressing the question she presents, and that's gun regulations. What he should have said, since he is putting himself in a position of a politician, introduce a comprehensive plan for gun laws, which will greatly reduce the rate of gun violence. Have national background checks in accordance to federal laws that prevent anyone from purchasing firearms without being screened by federal government agencies. This will reduce the most controversial gun violence in America in so-called mass shootings. But he didn't suggest this, he only proposed tougher sentencing for criminals, which is the effect, not the cause. The cause is allowing the criminals to commit the crimes, and I guess Knowles would vow to punish them accordingly. It's about preventive measures, not reactionary measures. Despite Knowles being depicted as dismantling his opponent's view on abortion, it actually creates an element of contradiction. And he distinguished that he himself, if elected to some official position politically, would combat that problem.
That's not me. I'm all for it. You want to get me a bill, you want to elect me to office and get a bill in front of me that will crack down on gang crime and these gangsters using handguns to kill kids? Let's do it. I'd sign that in 2 seconds.
Yet, never gave the same scenario or proposal to combat the so-called mass shootings? Knowles is slick, but not slick enough. Here's why. He specifically focused on handguns instead of guns in general because he wanted to avoid the assault rifle, which is the primary weapon being used in the so-called mass shootings. If he mentioned assault rifles, it changes the dynamic of what he would do to prevent the gun violence in America. You know what would happen? He would align with the very liberals he attacks as they seek to restrict or ban those assault rifles. Trust me, he chose his words and weapons of focus carefully. Despite his cynical responses and attacks on liberals, he's treading dangerous grounds in this debate, but nobody realizes it. And Knowles is quite lucky that his opponent is not articulate enough to expose him. This young lady has him in a corner, which Knowles is trying to intellectually sneak out of. I don't think she's falling for what could be considered red herrings.
But it's not up to me, unfortunately. It's up to the side that I suspect you would consider yourself to be on.
No, it's up to a side that you're often a part of. And even if it's not you specifically, it's your friends and the people you support that just continue to, it's just, you aren't considering both sides and how, saying one thing can just contradict the other thing.
How do you think I've done that?
By saying you're murdering babies, blah, 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 just over and over again, but just not mentioning any of the babies being murdered every single day in shootings that haven't even made it to major news outlets because they're so common.
And there you have it. She was not falling for the talking points he presented in attempts to deflect from the issue of an assault rifle restriction or ban. Although she mentioned babies and children being killed by gun violence, it was more centered around the so-called mass shootings. If she would have specified, who knows how deep the water would have been for him. Remember, the Republicans advocate far more for such weapons than any other political party. He would have had a hard time facing that question. Because Republicans have not supported a gun restriction or ban of assault rifles, it creates the narrative for the left that they provoke such so-called mass shootings to occur. And the young lady hit the nail right on the head in saying that Knowles either directly or indirectly supports Republicans who are within that circle of politicians that glorify assault rifles.
No, it's up to a side that you're often a part of. And even if it's not you specifically, it's your friends and the people you support.
And we can use the term glorify because radicals such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and other wackos in the Republican Party have no problem taking photos with their assault rifles. There is no need for them to do it, because the average American citizen knows they have the constitutional right to own that weapon. So who are they convincing or educating about that right? No one. Another femme fatale has popped up, harnessing assault rifles for photo ops. Anna Paulina, a so-called ex-military turned politician, flaunts her guns all over social media. But what I see is a real-life version of Lara Croft, depicted as a sex symbol for the male conservative base. This works in getting the sheep to vote, by the way. Plaster some gun bunny all over the political landscape and watch the right-wing zombies drool all the way to the polls to vote her into office. And sure enough, that's where she's at. If we look at the majority of Republicans plastering assault rifles all over social media, it's mainly women. There is no purpose for glorifying the weapons, it's not advocating for protecting the Second Amendment. It's actually only threatening that right because they are intentionally plastering those weapons all over the place amidst so-called mass shootings. We never saw these weapons being plastered all over the place, say 20 years ago, right? When the so-called mass shootings started popping up, so did the Republicans being depicted flaunting those weapons. To cause even more tension, she among other Republicans wore assault rifle pins soon after the so-called mass shootings? Clearly this is intentional, but don't fall asleep, both parties are simply mudslinging in the matrix. But we break them down in that matrix. If you were genuine, you would take a moment to stop thinking about yourselves and your political careers and think about the children who are being so-called massacred by the very weapons you promote. But what do you expect with corrupt politicians? And these are the very Republicans that Knowles dare criticize. What if a Republican's relative or even one of their children were so-called massacred by one of these assault rifles? I bet they would think twice about flaunting them all over social media, right? They are no different than Hollywood's glorification of guns, the music industry, or video games. So in essence, she is winning the debate by proxy. Although she is young and may be a bit indoctrinated by the left's ideologies, her question raised an issue for Knowles in which he is somewhat dancing around. He is dancing because he can't directly answer or give a solution to her inquiry due to his affiliation, perhaps even loyalty, to the Republican Party. The NRA, or National Rifle Association, is politically invested in the Republican Party. So Knowles will not advocate for a restriction or ban of assault rifles because the NRA more than likely has a few dollars behind him. This debate is definitely not taking candy from a baby, that baby is putting up a tough defense.
No, well, that wouldn't be a contradiction or a hypocrisy or anything. I'm focusing on one particular issue called abortion, but I actually mentioned in the speech tonight that specifically on the issue of black people being murdered, 10,000 black people are murdered every year with guns and knives and hammers and the like, but 242,000 black people at the very least are murdered through abortion. So that would seem to be a more pressing issue, but I brought it up. I'm all for trying to reduce the murder rate.
Now I'm not sure what a specific race has to do with anything here, even the topic of abortion. His opponent never posed a question about race in regards to abortion or gun violence. This would be a straw man, used to redirect the focus from her question to triggering a quote, alert, of the very mention of black people. Something conservatives claim liberals do in debates, right? Well, look at that, the liberal didn't mention race here, it was the conservative. It's not relevant to what her question was. Remember, if we go to the beginning of the debate, she was not challenging Knowles about abortion itself, she was challenging him about gun violence against children, which she could use as a tactic to show he is actually contradicting himself about abortion. A proxy was used, and it caused Knowles to deflect, as he didn't want to look hypocritical in the debate. But he did. He deflected so far, all the way to mentioning race. Putting it into perspective for you, the young liberal asked him about gun regulation, and he mentions the black community. No relevance to gun regulation whatsoever. Of course, if there was a discussion about race, well, yeah. But race was never presented by her, nor did she allude to any racial element in regards to abortion or gun violence. He mentioned race to sway the conversation away from her point. Everything he accuses the left of doing, he did. He accuses them of deflecting, he did that. He accuses them of using race, he did that. He accuses them of essentially murdering a human life with abortion, while he is essentially murdering children by not advocating for gun restrictions of assault rifles. But the audience does not see this, they are so conditioned to anticipate the quote, gotcha moment against liberals. He failed. Knowles did not school the liberal, never underestimate the left's cunning mind. Even if it's coming from a so-called woke liberal.
Unfortunately, liberal DAs are not allowing us to do that. So, you're more than welcome to convince your fellow liberals to stop funding these people and to start arresting criminals. But my side of the political aisle has been arguing to arrest and keep those criminals locked up for a very long time. And so there's very little we can do if the other side of the aisle won't work with us.
Knowles was defeated on principle, yet he received the applause from the audience. He was defeated on principles, because although the young lady supports the right to abortion, which doesn't mean she would do it by the way, Knowles is contradicting himself by not showing his concern for the children who are so-called massacred. Stop! Before you say the young lady is also contradicting herself, let me explain the difference. Well, for one, she's a liberal, they naturally contradict themselves, without even trying. But they sacrifice themselves in such debates, to magnify a flaw from their political enemies on the right. And this time, it worked. Knowles is claiming that abortion is evil, immoral, wicked, and should be outlawed in all 50 states in America, right? The reason for this is he cherishes the life of that unborn child in the womb. But the point that the young lady was making is how can you cherish that life, but not cherish the life of children who are being so-called massacred? Remember, every time we expected him to focus on the very issue of so-called mass shootings, he deflected from it, and to make matters worse, he used political talking points against his opponent, which didn't address the issue she raised to him. And the thing is, even if it's about gun violence in general, he doesn't provide a solution by way of revised gun legislation, yet ironically criticizes the current and past legislation as being ineffective. If you criticize the current gun legislation, and you are considered a public figure politically, pretty sure you have an idea of what could be done about it, right? You present those ideas and philosophies about everything you think the liberals are doing wrong. And to suggest that gun legislation hasn't been effective in preventing gun violence, and specifically the so-called mass shootings, indicates that Knowles is strategically avoiding presenting any real solution, as it will change the conversation about gun violence. Which both Republicans and Democrats would agree with. We can't have that, right? Of course not. Simply put, he's more concerned with mudslinging in such a condescending way against liberals, but when a young liberal challenged him about gun regulations, he never presented an actual solution. Stating that you will lock up criminals and keep them there, as opposed to the left, is not presenting a regulation on guns. I need you to really pay attention to what was stated. She asked about gun regulation, yet Knowles didn't give an actual gun regulation, he rambled on about making sure criminals are punished. There are gun regulations subject to each state, but of course we are talking about a national regulation, mandated by the federal government. You know, such as prohibiting the sale of a firearm on a local or state level that does not follow the criteria established by the federal government. This criteria is simple. All sales of firearms must initially go through a screening process by the FBI. Any sale or attempt of sale of assault rifles will require a screening process, and the citizen is ordered to pledge allegiance in front of the United States Supreme Court, swearing under oath. They are also automatically enlisted in the Safe American Society, members of this organization own assault rifles, and are sworn to, you see? That would essentially erase all of the so-called mass shootings. Safe American Society is literally something I just made up, don't know if it actually exists. But you get the point, right? If I presented a solution in 30 seconds, why couldn't Knowles offer a similar solution? Knowles continued to blame Democrats for their ineffective policies regarding gun crimes, but he himself never provided a solution. He made sure to establish the debate was primarily about abortion, and that he has discussed the element of gun violence. But you are being challenged about that gun violence, right now, so you should have a solution ready to go, right? When asked about regulations, he should offer a plan, an idea, something. That young liberal used abortion as a reference to gun violence against children, which has been used by the left before. It's a clever tactic. Basically challenging his views, and if they are genuine, or just being politically opportunistic. Based on the behavior and responses he provided, Knowles is a political opportunist. It's evident. He immediately went into attack mode against the left, as a way to condition the audience to see her as such. The key statements were about the federal government not being competent, and specifically, or cunningly, only mentioning handguns in regards to gun violence. Knowles knew very damn well what particular gun violence she was referring to. But he wouldn't be able to blame Democrats for that weapon, that is more of the Republicans' accountability. That's why the young liberal challenged him about it. Do you understand? While Knowles joked throughout the debate, depicted as being, quote, morally superior based on being pro-life, he actually ended up with no stance at all. Because if you don't fight for the children that are so-called massacred in so-called mass shootings, by way of restricting the purchase of the weapon used, then what moral superiority do you actually have? Sarcasm seems to be his only advantage in this debate. Knowles is just another political opportunist, who uses controversial topics, and uses it as a political football, it's that simple. He uses Christianity to influence the conservative base, who also condemn abortion, so he's always gonna seem, quote, righteous to them. But, if he is dancing around a question of gun regulation, how can he truly care about the life of anyone? This is the chaos sector.